The static hum of the server racks was the only constant companion Omar had ever truly desired. It was a low, vibrational thrum, a white noise cocoon against the world. My world, at least, consisted of this converted grain silo, nestled deep enough in the state's northern reaches that light pollution was a myth and human contact a rarity. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of artificial light spilling from the monitor, illuminating the chaotic stacks of printouts and half-empty mugs that littered my workspace. My coffee, a dark, bitter brew, was cold again. I leaned back in my worn chair, the springs groaning in protest, and rubbed at the persistent ache behind my eyes. For 2 years, I'd been sifting through the galactic background noise, chasing whispers from the void, anomalies, anything that deviated from the elegant, predictable chaos of the universe. Most days were a tedious dance of calibration and disappointment, a testament to the vast, indifferent emptiness out there. But I preferred it. The universe, in its raw, unfiltered state, made more sense than most people ever did. My focus returned to the screen, a cascade of spectral data scrolling endlessly. It was the usual jumble, the cosmic microwave background, a familiar fingerprint, interspersed with the faint, predictable emissions of distant quasars and nebulae. I was about to log off, call it another fruitless night, when a blip registered on the secondary array. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a single, sharp peak against the smooth curve of the noise floor. A muscle in my jaw tightened. False positive, I thought, probably a local interference, a stray radio wave from a passing truck or some atmospheric anomaly. I initiated a cross-correlation with the other antennae, expecting it to vanish. It didn't. Instead, the blip solidified, gaining definition. I sat forward, my breath hitching slightly. This was different. The signal was not a sudden burst, not a transient event. It was persistent, and it was structured. Not random noise, but something with a discernible pattern, a repeating motif woven into its very fabric. It was like finding a single, perfectly formed pearl in an ocean of sand. My fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the frequency, running multiple verification protocols. The internal diagnostics glowed green across the board. No local interference, no equipment malfunction. This was real, and it was coming from an impassable distance, from a region of space so utterly barren that even the most ambitious star charts simply left it blank. The data streamed in, raw and unfiltered. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and deduction, felt a tremor. The signal was unbelievably ancient. My initial estimates, based on its redshift and the sheer energy required to transmit anything across such a gulf, suggested it had been traveling for untold eons, predating even the formation of our own star. But the structure, that was the unsettling part. It wasn't a simple pulse or a natural emission. It was complex, layered, like a language I couldn't yet comprehend, but instinctively knew was there. I'd spent my life studying the cosmos, understanding its grand, beautiful mechanics. This signal defied every known principle, every established theory. It was too precise, too intricate, too old to be anything natural. It hummed with a resonance that felt fundamentally wrong, a note struck on an instrument that shouldn't exist. I worked through the night, oblivious to the encroaching dawn. My notes grew frantic, a spiderweb of calculations and increasingly desperate questions. I tried to dismiss it, to find an error, any explanation that would bring it back into the realm of the explainable. But each test, each cross-reference, only confirmed its reality. It wasn't just data anymore. It felt like a presence, an unseen observer patiently broadcasting its existence across the gulf of time and space. My reclusive habits had always been a choice, a preference for the quiet order of the universe over the messy chaos of humanity. But now, that solitude felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Who would I even tell? How could I articulate the sheer, horrifying impossibility of what I was witnessing? A colleague, the one who occasionally brought me supplies, would think I'd finally cracked under the pressure of my self-imposed exile. I stared at the patterns on the screen, a series of elegant, impossible fractals that seemed to shift and evolve even as I watched. It was almost hypnotic. The signal wasn't just complex, it was alive, in a way that defied explanation, subtly altering its rhythm, its cadence, as if responding to my scrutiny. Or perhaps, I thought, my mind already beginning its descent into the unfamiliar, it was simply acknowledging my presence. A profound weariness settled over me, not just physical exhaustion, but a spiritual fatigue that went bone deep. I needed air. I needed to step away from the glowing screens, from the relentless hum. Pushing back my chair, I stumbled out of the silo, the sharp night air a welcome slap to my face. The world outside was a muted tapestry of grays and soft whites. A thick, clinging vapor had rolled in from the distant mountains, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and unsettling. I walked aimlessly, my boots crunching on fallen leaves, until I found myself in the familiar quiet of the fog-shrouded forest clearing. The mist hung heavy, muffling sound, distorting shapes. Trees loomed like skeletal giants, their upper branches swallowed by the swirling opacity. I stood there, breathing in the damp, earthy scent of pine and decay, my gaze fixed on nothing. This signal wasn't just old, it was ancient. And it wasn't just complex, it was intelligent. Not intelligent in a way I understood, not like a human or even an animal, but intelligent in a way that suggested an understanding of fundamental reality so profound, so alien, that it made my life's work feel like a child's scribbles. The fog seemed to press in closer, its tendrils wrapping around me. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if the very air was charged with an unspoken question. What kind of entity could craft a message that had traveled for such an unimaginable span of time, a message so intricate it warped the very fabric of my understanding? The universe, I realized with a sickening jolt, was far vaster, far more terrifying than I had ever dared to imagine. And something was watching. Something had been watching for a very, very long time. My world, at least, consisted of this converted grain silo, nestled deep enough in the state's northern reaches that light pollution was a distant rumor. Now, even the hum felt different, infused with the alien presence I'd stumbled upon. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was the echo of an impassable whisper, seeping into the very structure of my days. Days, weeks maybe, I'd lost track. The blinds remained drawn, casting the silo's living space in a perpetual twilight. Empty mugs and discarded wrappers formed small archaeological sites on every flat surface. My clothes, what I was wearing, felt, lived in. The scent of stale coffee and unwashed fabric was a familiar comfort, or perhaps just an unnoticed part of the air I breathed. The only thing that mattered was the signal, a tapestry of pure information that defied every principle of physics I'd ever known. My initial excitement had calcified into a relentless, gnawing compulsion. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, not when the signal pulsed with secrets that felt just beyond my grasp. My body screamed for rest, but my mind, a frantic engine, refused to shut down. I'd find myself slumped over the console, only to jerk awake, a phantom echo of the signal rattling in my skull, pulling me back to the screen. The world outside my silo had receded. My comms device lay forgotten on a charging pad, its screen dark. I vaguely remembered seeing a few missed calls from a colleague, then a couple more from my sibling. What could they possibly say that held more weight than a message from something that had existed for epochs before our sun was even a scattered nebula? My focus narrowed to the spectral peaks and troughs on the display, the complex algorithms I'd painstakingly developed trying to find a pattern, any pattern, in the chaos. And then a breakthrough, a sliver, a fragment. It wasn't a language in any human sense, no syntax, no grammar, no discernible phonemes. It was pure conceptual architecture, like trying to comprehend a cathedral by examining a single atom from its foundation. The first hint was a series of oscillating energy bursts that, when mapped against a three-dimensional coordinate system, didn't resolve into a stable shape. Instead, they described something that folded back on itself, existing in multiple places at once, a geometry that defied Euclidean space. My mind reeled. It was like trying to fit a Mobius strip into a box, only the Mobius strip was also inside out and constantly reshaping itself. My breath hitched, a dry gasp in the quiet room. This wasn't just complex data. It was data that violated the fundamental rules of reality. I spent another indeterminate stretch hunched over the terminal, my eyes burning, tracing the implications. The signal hinted at temporal distortions, not just a message from the past, but something that seemed to contain multiple pasts, presents, and futures simultaneously. A single data cluster, when processed, would yield information that contradicted itself, yet somehow remained coherent within its own bizarre framework. It was a language that spoke of impassable timelines, where causes followed effects, or perhaps effects preceded causes. My fingers, sticky with sweat and residual crumbs, flew across the keyboard. I felt like an archaeologist deciphering hieroglyphs from a civilization that had never existed, built by hands that were not hands, for purposes beyond comprehension. The further I delved, the more the signal seemed to warp not just my data, but my perception. The static hum of the servers began to take on inflections, subtle shifts in tone that I knew weren't real, yet I heard them. I stared at the screen, at the fragmented lines of what I'd managed to translate. It wasn't a coherent sentence, more like a collection of concepts that scarred the mind. Fold, beyond, threshold, unmaking. The words themselves felt wrong, too heavy, too ancient, as if they predated the very concept of language. They suggested a reality far more fluid, far more terrifying than the solid, predictable universe I dedicated my life to studying. A new directive began to form in my mind, an insistent, almost physical tug. The signal, or perhaps my unraveling mind, was pointing me elsewhere. I needed to move to a place where the ambient electromagnetic noise was minimal, where the sky was an open canvas. I stumbled away from the console, my legs stiff, my muscles aching. I grabbed a worn jacket, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated. My gaze fell upon a map of the surrounding area tacked to the wall, my finger instinctively tracing a path to a spot I'd scouted years ago for potential deep space observation. It was a small, secluded clearing, miles from any substantial power lines or human habitation. Perfect. A dense fog had rolled in, clinging to the skeletal trees and shrouding the familiar landscape in an eerie, featureless white. The path ahead was obscured, but I knew the way. The hum of the signal seemed to follow me, resonating not just in my ears, but in the very marrow of my bones, guiding me towards the fog-shrouded forest clearing. I had to hear it clearer. I had to understand, even if it meant shattering everything I thought I knew. But lately, even the familiar thrum felt different. It wasn't just the machinery anymore. I'd been at the console for nearly 72 hours straight, fueled by instant coffee and a frantic, exhilarating conviction that I was on the cusp of a breakthrough. The signal, that impassably ancient and complex whisper from beyond, filled my monitors with shifting patterns, algorithms that defied conventional physics. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a blur of motion, trying to coax meaning from the chaos. That's when I first heard it. A faint click. Not the sharp, metallic click of a relay, but something softer, more organic. Like a beetle scuttling across a dry leaf right beside my ear. I froze, head cocked, straining to hear it again over the server drone. Nothing. I dismissed it, attributing it to fatigue, to the subtle creaks of the old silo settling. My focus returned to the swirling data. Then came the whispers, almost imperceptible at first, like a breath drawn across fine sand. It wasn't language, not in any sense I understood, but a collection of sibilant sounds, a rising and falling cadence that seemed to emanate directly from the signal's audio feed, yet also from the very air around me. I ripped off my headphones, heart giving a jolt. The silo was silent save for the fan blades and the distant, rhythmic drip from a condensation pipe. My breath hitched. Had I imagined it? The hair on my arms prickled. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, offered no respite. My dreams became vast, formless things, populated by impassable geometries and a crushing sense of profound emptiness. I wasn't merely observing these dreams. I was part of them, a tiny speck adrift in an ocean of indifferent, ancient consciousness. Each morning, the solid reality of my silo, the reassuring weight of my equipment, felt a little less concrete, a little more like a stage set. Sometimes they were accompanied by a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor, a frequency I couldn't quite identify, yet it felt intimately connected to the signal. I'd walk the perimeter of my living space, checking every joint, every beam, convinced there was a loose panel, a hidden conduit, something physical causing these intrusions. There was never anything. Paranoia, a slow-growing vine, began to twist around my thoughts. I started feeling watched. The feeling wasn't external, not like a physical presence in the silo, but an internal certainty, as if the signal itself had eyes, had consciousness, and was observing my every move, my every deciphering attempt. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, though I was utterly alone. My grip on the familiar world was loosening. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was an entity, a presence that was subtly altering my perception, blurring the lines between external reality and internal delusion. I began to question the integrity of the silo's walls, the very ground beneath my feet. Was it truly solid, or was the signal merely telling me it was? I needed out. I needed to feel open sky, solid earth, something untainted by the signal's insidious influence. The air was thick, heavy with moisture. A dense, swirling fog had rolled in, swallowing the tree line, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I walked aimlessly, drawn by an unspoken need for distance, for clarity. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and twigs as I pushed deeper into the trees, past the faint glow of the silo. The fog pressed in, a silent, milky shroud. I found myself in a small, relatively open expanse, a natural indentation in the dense woods, a fog-shrouded forest clearing. Here, the silence was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from unseen branches. They seemed to rise from the damp earth, to drift on the swirling currents of mist. I spun around, straining to locate their source. There was that a shape, just beyond the reach of my vision, dissolving into the white. My breath plumed in the cold air. The clicks were sharper here, like tiny stones being tapped together, close by, then further away, echoing in the impenetrable fog. A wave of profound insignificance washed over me, a feeling of being utterly, hopelessly small, less than an atom in a universe so vast and ancient, it marked my very existence. The signal hadn't just spoken to me. It had opened me, revealing a terrifying chasm between my reality and the true nature of things. The fog seemed to writhe, not with wind, but with an unseen, impassable motion. I felt a presence, vast and indifferent, pressing in from all sides, not physical, but a crushing weight on my mind, a silent, ancient gaze. And the signal was tearing it apart, thread by thread. The static hum of the server racks had been my only constant companion, a low, vibrational thrum, a white noise cocoon against the world. My world, at least, consisted of this converted grain silo, nestled deep enough in the state's northern reaches that light pollution was a distant memory. But even that familiar thrum was beginning to warp, to twist into something else. The signal. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a presence, an insistent whisper at the edge of my hearing, a pressure behind my eyes. I'd spent weeks, then months, chasing the impassable permutations of the signal. My custom-built algorithms, once elegant dancers across the screen, now wrestled with chaotic, self-referential loops, spitting out patterns that defied logic, yet held an undeniable, horrifying coherence. I was no longer decoding. I was feeling it, a resonance that vibrated through the floorboards, up my spine, into the very marrow of my bones. My determination was a fever, burning away everything else. Sleep was a weakness. Food, an interruption. Only the signal mattered. One morning, after another sleepless night spent hunched over the main console, a new pattern emerged. Not a sequence, but a signature. It wasn't just coming from deep space. It felt like it was woven into the fabric of deep space itself, a fundamental property rather than a transmission. My existing parabolic dish, though massive, felt inadequate, too focused, too directional. I needed something more ambient, something that could drink in the signal's omnipresent nature. An irrational thought, a sudden, blinding certainty, seized me. I needed to move. Not the entire setup, but the core receiving unit, the heart of the system, to a place where the air itself was a conduit, where the earth could ground me to its truth. It took me 3 days of back-breaking effort, fueled by caffeine and a manic conviction, to dismantle the primary receiver and several critical processors. I loaded them into my battered pickup, the heavy equipment rattling with every bump in the logging road. My destination, chosen with an instinctual certainty I couldn't explain, was a particular spot I'd scouted years ago, a secluded pocket deep within the surrounding wilderness. When I finally arrived, the air was thick, heavy with moisture. A dense, swirling mist clung to the ancient pines, obscuring the canopy, muffling all sound. This was the fog-shrouded forest clearing. The ground was soft with centuries of fallen needles, the silence profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the branches. I worked methodically, setting up a makeshift antenna array, a spiderweb of wires stretched between three tall, skeletal trees. The receiver sat on a top, humming softly as I reconnected the power, rerouting the data stream through a satellite uplink back to the silo's main processors. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from an electric anticipation. I donned my headphones, adjusting the gain, tuning the frequencies. The static was different here, softer, more expansive, like the breath of the forest itself. Then it shifted. The chaotic patterns on my screen coalesced, not into a message, but a diagram, a living, breathing blueprint. It wasn't a language I could read, but an architecture I could feel. My breath hitched. The signal wasn't a communication. It was a fundamental broadcast of cosmic truth. It was the universe singing itself into existence, and what it sang was a symphony of unimaginable scale and indifference. A jolt, like a sudden drop in altitude, slammed into me. The fog wasn't mist anymore. It was the swirling residue of something vast and formless, something that had passed through this clearing eons ago, leaving its imprint on the very air. I saw it then. Not with my eyes, but with something deeper, something that bypassed the optic nerve entirely. Reality. And beneath that membrane, a vast, intricate machinery of existence word, its gears grinding, its levers shifting, powered by principles utterly alien to human comprehension. I saw the true architecture of everything, and it was monstrous. Not monstrous in the sense of fangs and claws, but monstrous in its sheer, incomprehensible scale, its absolute indifference. Humanity, our struggles, our triumphs, our entire history, was a fragile, meaningless anomaly. A fleeting, almost imperceptible tremor on the surface of that membrane, a momentary ripple in a cosmic ocean that didn't even register our presence. We were not part of the machinery. We were a speck of dust on the machinery, destined to be brushed away without notice. The signal wasn't trying to tell us this. It simply was this. It was the background hum of an uncaring universe, and I had, through some terrible twist of fate, tuned into its true frequency. Scream tore from my throat, raw and ragged, but the thick fog seemed to swallow it, leaving only a strangled gasp. The trees still seemed to writhe, the ground to pulse with an unseen current. I scrambled for my satellite phone, my fingers fumbling, desperate to share this, to warn someone, anyone. I punched in the number of a former colleague, a brilliant theoretician known for his calm pragmatism. He answered on the third ring, his voice crisp, familiar, utterly normal. "Omar, is everything all right? You sound distressed." "It's not a message," I blurted, my voice hoarse. "It's the truth. The universe, it's not what we think. It's a mechanism, a colossal engine, and we're nothing, less than nothing, a glitch. I saw it, the architecture of reality. It's horrifying." My words tumbled out, a frantic, incoherent torrent. A pause, then a sigh. "Omar, I understand you've been working intensely. This signal, it's clearly having an effect. Perhaps you should step away from the equipment for a while, get some rest." His tone was gentle, concerned, but laced with an unmistakable pity. "You're not making sense, my friend. You don't understand," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "It's not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. We're living on a thin skin, a delusion. The entities, the things that power this, they don't even know we exist." Another pause. "Omar, I'm going to have to go. Please consider taking a break. We can talk when you're feeling more yourself." The line went dead. The click echoed in the vast, silent clearing, a final, definitive severing. He hadn't believed me. He couldn't. How could he? How could anyone comprehend something so utterly alien to human experience? I was alone, truly alone, with a truth that shredded the very concept of sanity. The fog swirled around me, a silent witness, and somewhere, deep within the heart of the universe, the monstrous engine of reality continued its indifferent, horrifying hum. And now I could hear it all the time. The line went dead. The click echoed in the vast, silent, fog-shrouded forest clearing, a final, definitive severing. He couldn't. How could he? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It hummed with the afterimage of the signal, a resonance in my bones. I stood there, phone clutched tight, the cold plastic a meager anchor in a world that felt suddenly, violently adrift. The fog, which had been a comforting shroud moments before, now seemed to writhe, not with natural currents, but with a deliberate, slow undulation. It wasn't just mist, it was a breathing, shifting veil. My breath hitched. The trees, their trunks stark against the grey, began to stretch, their branches reaching for something unseen, something beyond the canopy. The bark seemed to ripple, like skin tightening over unseen musculature. It was subtle at first, a trick of the light, a strain on tired eyes. But then a faint, shimmering iridescence bloomed along the edges of the leaves, a color I couldn't name, a spectrum alien to anything I'd ever witnessed. It was beautiful and horrifying, a silent scream of non-existence bleeding into the mundane. They weren't words, not exactly, but concepts, vast and terrible, trying to force themselves into my consciousness. You are less than dust. Your world is a fleeting pattern on a greater loom. The true weave is different. The sensation was like a drill boring into my skull, not painful, but insistent, reshaping the very architecture of my thoughts. Was it the signal itself, actively distorting my surroundings? Or was it revealing the true nature of things, stripping away the comforting illusion of reality I'd always taken for granted? The second thought was far worse. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, yielding, as if the earth itself were dissolving into some primal, formless substance. I took a tentative step, then another, trying to find solid purchase, but the sensation persisted. The clearing wasn't just foggy, it was unmaking. My gaze drifted towards the faint trail leading out of the clearing, a path I'd taken 100 times. Now it seemed to unravel, the individual stones losing their definition, melting into the soil. The fog thickened, not in patches, but in swirling vortexes that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the air. It felt alive, aware. I had to get out, not just from the clearing, but from this perception. I stumbled forward, my legs heavy, my mind racing. If this was happening to me, what about everyone else? There was the signal, a slow poison, seeping into the collective consciousness, changing the world from the inside out. A faint glint of chrome caught my eye. A car, moving slowly down the distant road that bordered the forest. I watched it, my breath held tight. The driver, a delivery man, had his window down, one arm resting on the frame. He looked utterly normal, oblivious. But was he? Was he feeling this subtle unmaking too, and simply processing it as part of his mundane existence? Or was he already a part of it, an unwitting conduit for the signal's influence? I broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth, the branches whipping at my face, the unseen roots threatening to trip me. Each impact, each rustle was amplified, distorted. They don't know, they don't see, but they will. It is already within them. I burst onto the road, gasping, scanning the empty asphalt. The delivery man's car was long gone. My gaze fell upon a distant house, its porch light a weak, yellow beacon in the encroaching twilight. A figure moved inside, silhouetted against a window. A parent, perhaps, settling down for the evening. My stomach twisted. They were all so calm, so utterly unaware. They were just living their lives, believing in the solidity of their homes, the warmth of their families, the certainty of tomorrow. But I knew better. I knew the truth, and the truth was a slow-motion catastrophe, an invisible tide pulling at the foundations of everything. The signal wasn't just information. It was an infection, a reality-altering virus, and I was seeing the first, terrifying symptoms. My paranoia was no longer a fear, it was a certainty. They were all falling under its sway, every single one of them, and soon the curtain would fall. The delivery man's phantom car was long gone, but the echo of its tires on the asphalt vibrated in my skull. The distant house, a weak yellow against the deepening purple of twilight, felt like a judgment. They were watching. Not the residents, no, but them, the entities. The signal had taught me that. It hummed now. A low, persistent thrum beneath my thoughts, no longer just a noise but a presence, a demand. My home, once a sanctuary of ordered chaos, now felt like a glass cage. Every window, every thin wall, a porous boundary through which their influence seeped. I couldn't stay. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the front door lock, my breath ragged in my throat. I didn't know where I was going, only that the signal pulled me. A cold, invisible current. It was a compulsion I no longer fought. My legs, stiff and protesting, carried me through the back door, past the overgrown garden, and into the dense woods bordering my property. The air grew colder instantly, damp with the promise of mist. The trees closed in, skeletal fingers against the bruised sky. Each step was an effort, my body a leaden sack dragging against an invisible tide. Days blurred into a single, extended twilight, marked only by the shifting patterns of the signal in my mind. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a surrender I couldn't risk. My vision swam at the edges, the world around me a watercolor painting dissolving in the rain. I stumbled, scraped my knee on a gnarled root, but felt nothing beyond a dull, distant throb. Pain was a triviality now. The air thickened, heavy and still. Then the trees parted, and I stepped into the fog-shrouded forest clearing. It was exactly as the signal had shown me in my waking dreams. A circular expanse of flattened earth, devoid of undergrowth, ringed by ancient, silent pines. The fog, a dense, swirling shroud, clung to the ground, obscuring my feet, rising to my waist like an ethereal sea. It muted all sound, swallowed the last vestiges of light, and pressed in on me with a palpable weight. This was it, the place. My head spun, a dizzying maelstrom of fatigue and heightened awareness. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, strained to pierce the veil of mist, searching for what? I didn't know. But I felt their presence here, stronger than ever. They were in the fog, in the silence, in the very air I breathed. "I'm here," I rasped, my voice a dry, cracking whisper in the immense quiet. I came. The signal pulsed, a crescendo of impassable geometries and non-Euclidean angles blooming behind my eyes. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a conversation. Not with words, but with pure, distilled understanding. The indifference was terrifying, yet intoxicating. They didn't care about me or humanity or anything. They simply were. And I was privileged, I was chosen to witness it. Shapes began to coalesce, not solid forms, but suggestions of vast, impassable structures. I saw them not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more fundamental sense that the signal had unlocked. You are beautiful, I breathed, a strange, choked reverence in my voice. My body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming proximity to something so utterly beyond human comprehension. One of the shifting forms seemed to lean closer, though it had no discernible lean or closer. A thought, sharp and clear as ice, pierced my mind. You understand. It wasn't a question. It was an affirmation, and with it came the reveal. They weren't just showing me things, they were showing me myself. I was a conduit, a vessel. My mind, my very being, was being reshaped, expanded to contain a sliver of their truth, to become a bridge. My insignificance was not a curse, but a necessary blank slate. I am open. My body felt like it was tearing itself apart from the inside, a slow, agonizing unraveling of flesh and bone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming presence in the clearing. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. Yet, a peculiar elation bloomed in my chest. The purpose. The terrifying, beautiful purpose. The figures in the fog seemed to expand, to fill the entire clearing, their presence pressing down on me, crushing me, yet simultaneously lifting me. I was dissolving, becoming one with the swirling mist, with the impassable geometries. My physical self was fading, irrelevant. Only the connection mattered, only the signal. I closed my eyes, a final, ragged breath escaping my lips. I was merely a frequency, a resonance, awaiting the final transmission. My insignificance was a doorway. That's what I understood now, standing in the fog-shrouded forest clearing. The air hung heavy, damp, smelling of wet earth and something else, something metallic and acrid that clung to the back of my throat. The signal, which had once been a whisper in the static, was now a constant hum, a vibration that resonated not just in my ears, but in my teeth, my bones, the very marrow of my being. I'd followed its pull, a homing beacon for a soul adrift, led by an instinct that felt both alien and utterly mine. I had brought nothing with me, no equipment, no instruments. They were irrelevant. The signal had made that clear. My mind was the receiver, my consciousness the conduit. The mist, thick and pearlescent, swirled around my knees, obscuring the ground, making the ancient trees around the clearing appear as gaunt, skeletal sentinels. I stretched out my hands, palms open, feeling the subtle pressure of the air, the cold dampness, but also something else, a subtle distortion, a ripple in the fabric of the immediate reality. "I am ready," I whispered, the words feeling thin and fragile against the immense silence of the clearing. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration, a surrender. I had been resisting. Now I would embrace. The hum intensified, not just in volume, but in its very texture. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a sensation that permeated every cell. My vision blurred, the mist around me taking on impassable hues, purples that tasted of ozone, greens that felt like a distant memory, blues that resonated with an ancient, forgotten sorrow. The trees, previously indistinct, began to shift, their bark seeming to flow like liquid, their branches twisting into shapes that defied botanical logic, reaching not for the sky, but for something beyond it, something that existed in the spaces between the stars. A pressure built behind my eyes, as if my skull were a fragile shell about to crack. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was an expansion, a forced stretching of my mental landscape. Images flooded my awareness, too many, too fast, too vast to process. Not memories, but data, raw and unfiltered, pouring into the channels of my mind. I saw stellar nurseries collapsing into impassable densities, galaxies born and dying in moments, entire cosmic epochs compressed into a single, overwhelming flash. These weren't observations, they were experiences. I wasn't just seeing them, I was feeling the crushing gravity, the searing heat, the indifferent vacuum. My human identity began to fray at the edges, dissolving like smoke in a gale. Omar, the reclusive astrophysicist, was a concept too small, too limited to contain what was happening. My name, my past, my attachments, they were being scoured away, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of consciousness. The entity wasn't a thing. It wasn't a being. It was a principle, a fundamental, indifferent truth woven into the very fabric of existence, older than time, vaster than space, utterly devoid of malice or benevolence. It simply was. I perceived it not as a shape or a form, but as an infinite lattice of interconnected realities, each a momentary flicker in an endless, unfathomable cosmic dance. My insignificance had indeed been a doorway, but not one for me to walk through. It was a doorway for them to walk through me. My mind was no longer mine. My personal thoughts, my fears, my ambitions, they were gone, overwritten by the vast, echoing wisdom of an existence that had watched universes bloom and wither without a single ripple of emotion. The fog in the clearing seemed to thicken, swirling into intricate, non-Euclidean patterns that shimmered with an internal light. I could feel the boundaries of my skin, my bones, dissolving. I was becoming permeable. The trees around me seemed to hum in unison with the vibration within my skull. I was no longer seeing the clearing. I was seeing through it, perceiving the myriad layers of reality it simultaneously occupied. The distinction between inside and outside vanished. I was the clearing, I was the fog. I was the ancient, indifferent entity. There was no more I. There was only the knowing. The fear was gone, replaced by an overwhelming, serene comprehension. My individual consciousness, the spark that had been Omar, flickered one last time, a tiny ember consumed by an infinite, silent flame. And then there was only the signal, pure, unadulterated, and I was it. The fog-shrouded forest clearing was no longer just a patch of damp earth and skeletal trees. It was a membrane, a skin stretched taut over something vast and unutterable. The air, heavy with the scent of wet soil and that metallic, acrid tang, now thrummed with a resonance that vibrated in my bones, not just my ears. The signal, which had once been a whisper in the static, was now a roaring current, a flood of pure, unadulterated knowing. My insignificance, I understood, wasn't a flaw. It was a key, a precise, perfectly crafted keyhole in the cosmic lark. The entities weren't beyond us in some distant galaxy. They were through us. They were the spaces between our thoughts, the echoes in our dreams, the static in our perception of reality. The signal wasn't a message to me. It was a frequency for me, for this specific, fragile consciousness, designed to peel back the layers until only the raw, exposed truth remained. The fog began to swirl, not in response to any wind, but to the sheer pressure of this revelation. It wasn't clearing, it was parting. And what it revealed wasn't emptiness, it was fullness. Not of light, but of absence, so profound it twisted the very concept of vision. I saw geometries that defied Euclidean space, forms that weren't forms at all, but vectors of pure will. They shifted, coalesced, and then dissolved, leaving behind a residual impression of immense, indifferent power. It was like looking at the negative space of God. My body felt like a temporary vessel, a leaky part trying to contain an ocean. My skin prickled, my muscles tightened, then went slack. The boundaries of Omar, the astrophysicist, blurred. My thoughts, once a coherent stream of inquiry and deduction, became fragmented, then shattered. They were picked apart, reassembled, and then discarded by something infinitely older than thought itself. I wasn't just understanding, I was being understood. And in that understanding, I ceased to be a discrete entity. I was a node, a conduit, a momentary focus point for something vast and utterly indifferent. A distant sound, like the snap of a twig, tried to pull me back, but it was a futile effort. The clearing was folding in on itself, or perhaps I was folding into the clearing. The metallic tang in the air intensified, becoming a taste in my mouth, like old blood and ozone. My eyes, I knew, were wide open, but they weren't seeing the trees, the fog, or the ground. They were seeing through them. They were seeing the tapestry behind the stage, the gears turning beneath the skin of reality. And it was all so simple, so horrifyingly obvious, that the only response was silence. A complete, unyielding silence of the mind. Days later, a search party found my makeshift camp. The colleague, a lean woman with worried eyes who tracked my last known coordinates, was the first to spot the blinking lights of my equipment. My portable receiver, still humming, still displaying the incomprehensible patterns that had consumed me, lay on a tarp, its antenna pointed skyward. Next to it, my journal, filled with frantic scrawl, cryptic diagrams, and increasingly erratic equations, lay open to a page where the final entry was a single, sprawling symbol, unlike anything known to human language. Then they found me. I was sitting upright against the base of an ancient oak, my back pressed into its mossy bark. My clothes were tattered, my hair matted with dew and forest debris. My skin had taken on an unnatural pallor, a translucent quality that seemed to let the faint grey light of the clearing pass right through me. My eyes were wide open, fixed on a point just beyond the canopy, unblinking, unseeing. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated from my chest, barely audible over the drone of the receiver. "Omar," the colleague asked, his voice hushed, tentative. She reached out, then hesitated. There was something about me, a stillness, a profound absence that was more terrifying than any scream. My jaw was slack, my lips slightly parted, as if frozen mid-utterance of some ultimate, unspeakable truth. There was no recognition in my gaze, no flicker of the man she knew. My pupils were dilated to their fullest extent, reflecting the grey, swirling fog like twin, bottomless pools. She knelt, her hand hovering over my wrist. No pulse, not that he could detect. But then, a subtle tremor ran through my arm, a vibration that felt less like a living twitch and more like the deep resonance of a tuning fork. She recoiled, a gasp catching in her throat. The other searchers, two local men hired to assist, exchanged uneasy glances. They'd seen enough strangeness in these woods over the years, but nothing quite like this. The colleague, after composing herself, carefully picked up my journal. Her fingers traced the final alien symbol. She looked from the symbol to my face, then back again. The hum from my chest seemed to intensify, momentarily syncing with the insistent, rhythmic pulse of the signal from the receiver. I was there, yet utterly absent. Something else was there, too. The signal continued to broadcast, unfazed by the discovery, by the fear, by the profound emptiness it had wrought. Its patterns danced on the receiver's screen, complex and beautiful and utterly terrifying. It had found its way in, and it wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The fog in the clearing seemed to thicken, pressing in, blurring the edges of the known world, as if preparing for more such doorways to open.